On July 23, the European Union approved the 21st package of sanctions against Russia, making it the largest in terms of the number of new sanction parties added in the past 4 years. The restrictions affected 218 listings, 170 organizations, and 48 individuals. The total number of those under European sanctions because of the war against Ukraine has approached 3,000. The main blow of the sanctions hit Russia's banking system. 94 Russian banks and major financial institutions have come under sanctions, and 33 of them have been completely disconnected from the SWIFT system. Plus the Moscow Exchange, which is the main trading organizer in the country, as well as Sheremetyevo Airport and 3 more regional airports. Plus 41 tankers from the Shadow Fleet, bringing the total number of sanctioned vessels close to 700. But the next day, on July 24th, something happened that analysts did not expect at all. The Central Bank of the Russian Federation lowered the key interest rate, and this happened right after Vladimir Putin publicly demanded it, even though it doesn't make any economic sense at all. So in this episode, we'll break down what's in the EU sanctions package, who was personally targeted, and why. The decision of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation looks like politics, not economics. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's break down this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are moving towards the mark of 300,000 subscribers, so I would be grateful for your subscription. So I'll start with the banking sector, because that's where the Council of the European Union placed the main emphasis in the 21st package of sanctions. In the European Union, the sanctions package itself was criticized because sanctions against LNG projects were removed, as well as the clause banning Russian combatants from getting visas and traveling to Europe. But as they say, it is what it is. In Brussels, they stated directly that this time the greatest attention was given to the Russian financial and banking sector as an institution, as an instrument of Russia's war economy. This means that 94 financial organizations have come under restrictions. Among them are Renaissance Credit Bank, National Trust Bank, Uralsib, Avangard, Yandex Bank, VB Bank, and so on. Another 32 banks have been banned from making transactions, and 33 institutions have been completely disconnected from the SWIFT system. That means they have been deprived of a normal channel for international payments. And yes, like you, I was extremely surprised to find out that dozens of Russian banks were still operating on the SWIFT system and had the right to make international payments. The Russian crypto payment system AA7 was separately targeted. And this is a crucial point because it is through crypto schemes that Russia is trying to bypass sanctions. Plus, the European Union has added 4 more entities to the list that are connected to this crypto payment system AA7 and its activities in Africa. And the most high profile are the sanctions against the Moscow Exchange. This is an exchange holding, meaning it organizes trading within Russia. And here is a telling detail. The shares of the Moscow Exchange itself rose by about 1.2% on the day the sanctions were announced. So the Russian market was demonstratively pretending that nothing happened. Your sanctions are only beneficial to us. Next, the raw materials and transportation sectors were also hit quite hard by the sanctions. In the oil industry, Brussels added 3 Russian oil refineries and 1 refinery in Belarus to the list. Among them are the Kubishevsky and Novokubishevsky refineries, plus the company Lukoil Marin Bunker. Although, it seems to me that the Europeans are a little late with their sanctions, because Ukrainian drones have already done their work there. In addition, the price cap on Russian oil has been extended for another year. It remains at the level of $44.10 per barrel. That is, no one has the right to buy Russian oil at a higher price if they don't want problems with the European Union. By the way, Brent crude oil has already jumped to $100 per barrel. 41 new tankers from the Shadow Fleet are under sanctions. In total, that's already 673 vessels. Consider this, nearly 700 Shadow Fleet vessels face sanctions. And then they hit the metallurgy, gold mining, and diamond industries. So the list includes gold mining companies, Vysocheshi, Yuj Ural Zoloto, Pavlik, and Seligrad. And from the energy sector, Inter Arau EES. Plus, they hit the transport sector, because Sheremetyevo Airport and 3 other regional airports were also sanctioned. There is also a concession in the sanctions package, which should be honestly mentioned as well. Because everything looks, of course, nice, but here, a setback came from where we didn't expect it. The fact is that in the 21st sanctions package, an exception has still been preserved, allowing for the maritime transshipment of Russian liquefied gas to third countries for another 12 months. That's wild. So, according to Reuters sources, the European Union countries used this decision to show solidarity with Greece, whose ship owners make good money from this. This compromise enabled agreement on the full 21st sanctions package. If you didn't understand, let me explain what happened. So, the Russians are transporting their illegal liquefied natural gas to European ports. And there, they transfer it to other tankers for sale to third countries. That is, formally Europe does not buy this LNG, but it is in its ports that it is transferred to other tankers for further sale. And Greece makes very good money on this. And so Ursula von der Leyen stated the following as a result, quote, "We have taken an important step towards a formal ban on the entry of Russian military personnel into the European Union." She gave no details, but this is another concession. Let me remind you that initially she proposed to ban entry to all Russians who served in the military after February 24, 2022. But Italy and France expressed doubts. They thought that this would supposedly lead to a blanket ban on Russians entering, which wouldn't be a bad thing. But the French and Italians said no, we still need Russians for some reason. As a result, there is no ban, but there is some step in that direction. Ursula von der Leyen says, "We've taken an important step toward a formal ban, but there is no actual ban." Now the personal sanctions list, and here there is some particularly good news for us. So, Vladimir Medinsky, assistant to Vladimir Putin and the very person who negotiated with Ukraine, has been included in the sanctions list. In 2025, he led the Russian delegation at the negotiations in Turkey. In February of this year, he represented Moscow at the negotiations in Geneva. And here is the wording of the European Union in the justification for the sanctions against Medinsky. Quote, Medinsky is a central figure in the Russian government's propaganda. He is the author of textbooks that present Ukraine as part of the Russian world. And now Medinsky is banned from entering European Union countries, and any of his assets in the EU are subject to being frozen. In addition to him, the sanctions list includes Russia's Minister of Sports Mikhail Degtyaryov, the head of Gazprom Media Alexander Zhukov, the head of Russian Railways Oleg Belozyorov, Deputy Chairman of the Central Bank of Russia Sergei Belov, businessman Mikhail Gutseriev, singer Alexander Marshall, President of the Russian Olympic Committee Stanislav Pozniakov, and so on. And finally, they have added to the sanctions list that scumbag, that Russian bastard, General Roman Demirchiev. What kind of last name is that? Disgusting bastard. Why do I call him a bastard? Because this Roman Demirchiev, in correspondence with his relatives, his woman, and his fellow servicemen, bragged about torturing and executing Ukrainian prisoners of war. Such a creature actually exists in Russia. And now, the most interesting thing is what happened today, which says more about the state of the Russian economy than anything else. On July 24, the board of directors of the Central Bank of Russia lowered the key interest rate by 25 basis points to 14% per annum. This is already the 10th consecutive rate cut. And here's the key point to understand how absurd this all is. Analysts did not expect such a change in the rate. Moreover, just recently, banks actually started to factor in a rate increase instead. And that makes sense because of the fuel crisis, which is driving up inflation. Analysts were noting this on the interbank market, and the deputy chairman of the central bank, Alexei Zabotkin, even publicly said on July 14 that the regulator, quote, cannot turn a blind eye to the situation with fuel prices. So, according to market logic, the rate should have been raised. But on July 14th, something else was also said. The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin stated that the rate should be lowered, and he didn't care about the laws of economics. And 10 days later, the central bank, contrary to the expectations of the entire market, lowered the rate. At the same time, the regulator's own explanation sounds rather strange. Moreover, they say, our economy is in deep trouble, but we will lower the rate. Here's the quote. The Central Bank of the Russian Federation admits inflation expectations have increased. In June and July, the current pace of price increases accelerated, including due to rising fuel prices. In the second quarter, the economy grew only at a moderate pace, and businesses significantly lowered their expectations for future demand and production output. A temporary reduction in production capacity in certain industries was mentioned separately. This, if translated from bureaucratic language, is the result of our strikes on factories and oil refineries. So the situation is as follows. Prices are rising, production is falling, businesses don't expect future demand, but the interest rate is still being lowered. Well, because that's what Vladimir Putin said. The Central Bank of the Russian Federation will meet on September 11 and will lower the rate again before the elections. In short, now the Central Bank of Russia's interest rate is not an indicator of the real state of the economy at all, because it's being lowered by order of Vladimir Putin, completely against all logic and common sense. How does the Kremlin react to the new sanctions? Well, today the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov called the restrictions against Russian banks the usual pressure. The permanent mission of Russia to the EU stated that Moscow is preparing retaliatory measures and as usual promised that Europe itself will be worse off. But, interestingly, while the Russians were making threats, China unexpectedly responded to these sanctions. In my opinion, the Chinese have already stopped even hiding the fact that they are doing everything they can to keep unwashed Russia afloat. And today, China imposed sanctions against European companies in response to the European Union's sanctions against Russia. Reuters reports that Beijing has banned the supply of dual-use goods to 14 companies from the EU, including Rheinmetall and Poland's Vigo Photonics. China has stated directly that this is a response to the 21st package of EU sanctions, which included Chinese and Hong Kong companies for assisting the Russian military-industrial complex. So it turns out to be quite an interesting scheme, right? Europe puts pressure on Russia, and China punishes Europe for Russia because Russia itself can no longer do it. What does all this mean for us? Let's go through it. The 21st package of sanctions hit Russia where it really hurts. Disconnecting 33 banks from SWIFT, plus hitting the MOEX exchange and the crypto system AA7 makes settlements for oil more complicated, along with all these bypass schemes. Plus 41 tankers from the Shadow Fleet. This is direct pressure, similar to what our Ukrainian drones are doing physically. They are targeting the Shadow Fleet's tankers. But what's most revealing is actually something else. Sanctions are external pressure, but the decision of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation regarding the interest rate is already an internal diagnosis. When the central bank, contrary to its own logic and contrary to market expectations, lowers the interest rate at political behest, when inflation is accelerating due to the fuel crisis, it means that the independence of the financial regulator ended a long time ago. And an economy where the interest rate is determined not by inflation but by the wishes of the balding dwarf Vladimir Putin, sooner or later ends up with what we are already seeing. Empty gas stations, burning warehouses, capital fleeing from Russia, and so on. But on paper the economy supposedly prospers. Yes, it prospers so much that we can easily lower the interest rate. EU sanctions, of course, speed up this process. Our drones do too, and they do it very effectively. Well, and this kind of combination, in my opinion, should continue to put pressure on the Russians. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, I would be grateful. You can do this by donating through the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.